Lightning cracked across the sky, and Elena Voss froze on her porch steps, her heart pounding as a massive shape stumbled out of the tree line and collapsed into the mud in front of her. For a moment she thought it was a bear. Then the shape moved again, and she saw fur, gray and black, soaked with rain, and something darker, something that made her stomach drop. Blood, a lot of it. She should have run inside. She should have locked the door and called someone, anyone, to come deal with an injured wild animal on her property. That was what any sensible person would do. But Elena had never been very good at being sensible when something was suffering in front of her. She stepped off the porch into the storm. The wolf was enormous, easily twice the size of any wolf she had ever seen in a photograph or a nature documentary. Its side was torn open, 3 deep gashes running from its shoulder to its ribs, and its breathing came in short, ragged pulls. Its eyes, when they opened and found hers, were a strange, pale gold, almost glowing in the flashes of lightning. She had worked as a veterinary assistant for 6 years. She had held dying dogs while their owners sobbed, had stitched wounds on cats that hissed and clawed at her hands, had learned to read pain in an animal's body, the way other people read faces. She read it now, in the way this creature's legs trembled, in the low whine that escaped its throat. "Okay," she whispered, mostly to herself. "Okay, big guy, let's get you inside." It should not have been possible. A wolf this size should have outweighed her 3 times over, and by every rule of self-preservation she had ever learned, she should not have been able to drag it anywhere without losing a hand. But when she crouched beside it and slid her arms under its shoulders, it did not snap at her. It did not even flinch away. It simply looked at her, breathing hard, as if it were deciding something. Then, impossibly, it let her lift it. By the time she got the wolf through her front door and onto the thick rug in front of her fireplace, her arms were shaking, and her clothes were plastered to her skin with rain and blood. She kicked the door shut behind her, threw the deadbolt out of habit, and knelt beside the animal, already reaching for the emergency kit she kept under the kitchen sink for exactly this kind of situation, though she had never imagined using it on something quite this large. "This is going to hurt," she told it, unwrapping a roll of gauze. "I'm sorry. I need you to trust me for a few minutes." The wolf watched her with those strange gold eyes, and something in its gaze felt less like an animal, and more like a person, listening carefully to every word. She told herself it was exhaustion playing tricks on her. Wolves did not understand English. Wolves did not decide to trust anyone. But this one held very still while she cleaned the wound, only a low, pained growl escaping when the antiseptic touched raw skin. Kian Drosh had been Alpha King of the Nightfall Pack for 11 years, and in all that time, he had never once believed he would end up like this. Bleeding out on the floor of a stranger's cottage, too weak to shift back into his human form, entirely at the mercy of a woman who had no idea what she was touching. The attack had come from nowhere, 3 wolves he did not recognize, moving with a coordination that spoke of planning rather than chance. He had fought them off, had killed one and driven the others into the trees, but not before their claws found the soft place beneath his ribs. He had run until his legs gave out, until the forest blurred into streaks of dark green and gray. And then there had been a light in the distance, and a cottage, and a woman standing on a porch who did not scream when she saw him. He should shift back. His human body healed faster, and he could explain himself, tell her what he was, ask for help as a man, instead of collapsing at her feet as a beast. But the shift took strength he did not have, and every time he tried to gather himself for it, pain rolled through him like a wave and pulled him back under. So he stayed as he was, and let her clean the wound with hands that were gentle even when her voice shook with nerves, and told himself this was only temporary. A few hours, a day at most. He would heal, and he would leave, and she would never know that the wolf she had saved could have ended entire bloodlines with a single command. "There," Elena said finally, tying off the last strip of gauze around his ribs. "That should hold until morning. I don't have the equipment here to do stitches on something your size, but the bleeding's slowing down. That's good. That's really good." She sat back on her heels, looking at her work, and for the first time seemed to really process what she had just done. She had wrapped bandages around a wild wolf, in her living room, at night, alone. "I've officially lost my mind," she muttered, and the wolf, watching her, felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with his wound. Elena's cottage sat at the edge of Silver Hollow Forest, a good 20-minute drive from the nearest town, chosen specifically because she liked the quiet. She had grown up in a house full of noise, full of people who never quite noticed her, and when she was old enough to leave, she had gone looking for the opposite. A small clinic where she could work with animals who never lied to her, a cottage where the only sounds at night were wind and owls, a life that asked very little of her, and gave her, in return, a peace she had never known before. She had not expected that peace to end with a bleeding giant wolf in front of her fireplace. She spent the rest of that night on the floor beside him, feeding the fire, checking his bandages every hour, watching the slow rise and fall of his massive chest. Around dawn, exhaustion finally caught up with her, and she fell asleep sitting up, her back against the couch, one hand resting near the wolf's paw, without her quite meaning to put it there. Kian woke first. The pain in his side had dulled to a deep, manageable ache, and his strength, while still far from what it should be, had returned enough that he could lift his head and take in the room properly for the first time. It was small and warm, filled with soft light from the dying fire, books stacked on every surface, a kettle on the stove, a life built by someone who valued comfort over grandeur. And there she was, Elena Voss, though he did not know her name yet, curled against the couch in a position that could not possibly be comfortable, dark hair falling across her face, one hand still near his paw, as though even in sleep, some part of her wanted to be sure he was still breathing. He should leave. Now, while she slept, while his strength allowed him to at least attempt movement, he should slip out into the forest and find his way back to Nightfall territory, back to his pack, back to the search parties that were surely combing the woods for him by now. Instead, he found himself simply watching her. It had been a long time since anyone had looked at him the way she had the night before, without fear, without calculation, without the careful deference that came from knowing exactly how much power he held over their lives. As Alpha King, every interaction he had was shaped by his title. His betas watched their words around him. His council weighed every sentence for political meaning. Even Rhea, his second in command, and the closest thing he had to a true friend, treated him with a wariness born of respect for his position, rather than affection for the man beneath it. This woman had looked at a bleeding, terrifying animal and seen only a creature in pain that needed help. He did not understand why that mattered so much to him, but it did. Elena woke an hour later to sunlight streaming through the windows, and the strange, disorienting realization that she had fallen asleep on her living room floor beside a wolf that, by every rule of nature, should have either killed her in the night or fled the moment her back was turned. Instead, he was still there, watching her with those pale gold eyes, his breathing steady and much less labored than it had been. "Well," she said, sitting up and rubbing the stiffness from her neck, "you're either the most trusting wild animal in the history of the world, or I've officially become the kind of person who talks to wolves like they understand her." The wolf tilted his head slightly, an oddly human gesture, and Elena laughed despite herself, a short, surprised sound. "Right, talking to wolves. Great start to the day." She checked his bandages, relieved to find the bleeding had stopped almost entirely overnight, though the wounds themselves looked far more healed than they had any right to be after a single night. She frowned at that, running her fingers gently along the edge of the gashes, noting how the skin had already begun knitting together in a way that defied everything she knew about animal physiology. "That's not normal," she said quietly. "That's really not normal." Kian watched her notice, watched the careful, curious way she studied his healing wounds, and felt a flicker of alarm. He was healing too fast for an ordinary wolf, and she was observant enough to see it. He needed to be more careful. He needed to control the pace of his own recovery, slow it if he could, until he was strong enough to disappear back into the forest without raising questions he could not safely answer. But some part of him, a part he did not fully trust, was not entirely sure he wanted to disappear yet. "I should probably call someone," Elena said, sitting back and studying him. "Animal control, maybe, or a wildlife rescue. Someone who actually knows what they're doing with wolves. I only know dogs and cats, and the occasional very angry parrot." At the words animal control, something in the wolf's posture changed, a stillness that felt almost like tension, and he let out a low sound, not quite a growl, more like a protest. Elena blinked. Okay, you didn't like that idea. Another low sound, and this time she could have sworn it was closer to agreement than complaint. You understand me, she said slowly, testing the theory even as she felt ridiculous for entertaining it. Do you understand me? The wolf held her gaze and, very deliberately, dipped his head in something that looked remarkably like a nod. Elena sat very still for a long moment, her mind racing through every rational explanation and finding none of them satisfying. Wolves did not nod. Wolves did not respond to specific words with specific reactions. And yet here she was, staring into eyes that seemed to hold far more understanding than any animal should possess. Okay, she said finally, deciding, in the way she often did, to simply accept the strange thing in front of her, rather than fight it. No animal control. I'll take care of you myself, but you have to promise not to eat me while I sleep. The wolf let out a huff of air that was, unmistakably, something like a laugh, and Elena found herself smiling, despite the absurdity of the entire situation. I'm calling you Shadow, she decided, reaching out slowly to rest her hand against the thick fur of his neck, watching for any sign of protest and finding none. Until you tell me your actual name, which, since you're apparently a wolf and can't talk, might be a while. If he could have laughed properly, Kian would have. Instead, he allowed himself to lean, just slightly, into her hand, and told himself it meant nothing more than gratitude for a stranger's kindness. He was lying to himself, and some distant, wiser part of him already knew it. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Elena went to work at the small clinic in town each morning, leaving Shadow with a bowl of water, and, after the first day of frustrated pacing on his part, the run of the cottage rather than confinement to one room. She returned each evening to find him waiting by the door, an image so domestic and strange that she sometimes stood on the porch for a full minute before going inside, trying to convince herself this was actually her life now. She talked to him constantly, the way she had always talked to animals in her care, except that with Shadow, the one-sided conversations felt less one-sided than they should have. She told him about her day at the clinic, about the stubborn old dog with the torn ligament, about the young couple who had come in with their first kitten and asked 17 questions about whether it was normal for cats to sleep so much. She told him things she had never told anyone else, too, about the family she had left behind, loud and demanding, and never quite seeing her, about the loneliness she had chosen for herself out here at the edge of the forest, a loneliness that had felt like freedom until, somehow, a wolf's steady presence began to make her wonder if she had simply traded one kind of isolation for another. Kian listened to all of it, every word. He learned, in those first days, more about genuine human kindness than he had learned in 11 years of ruling a pack built on strength and fear. He watched Elena tend to his wounds without complaint, watched her sacrifice her own comfort for his, watched her offer trust to a creature that could, if he chose, end her life in seconds. And he found himself, for the first time he could remember, wanting to be worthy of that trust, rather than simply wielding it. Back in Nightfall territory, the forest 30 miles to the north, where his true home lay hidden behind ancient wards and careful secrecy, panic had taken hold. His absence, now stretching past a week, had thrown the pack into chaos. Whispers moved through the ranks like fire through dry grass. The Alpha King was dead. The Alpha King had been overthrown. The Alpha King had fled his duties and abandoned them all. Rhea, his second in command, refused to believe any of it, though the strain of holding the pack together in his absence had begun to show in the sharp edges of her voice and the shadows beneath her eyes. She organized search parties that returned each time with nothing. She fielded questions from a nervous council that grew bolder by the day, in its suggestions that perhaps new leadership was needed. She did not know that her king was 30 miles away, lying by a fireplace with his head resting against the knee of a woman who had no idea she was housing the most powerful wolf in the region, listening to her read aloud from a worn paperback novel, because she had decided, on a whim, that Shadow seemed to enjoy the sound of her voice. He did enjoy it, more than he had any right to. And somewhere in the space between healing wounds and quiet evenings, Kiandrak began to understand that he was in far more danger now than he had been the night those 3 wolves tore into his side. Because the danger closing in on him now had nothing to do with claws or fangs. It had everything to do with the woman kneeling beside him, offering pieces of her heart to a creature she believed could never understand, or return them, entirely unaware that every word she spoke was being kept, carefully and completely, by a king who was quickly realizing he did not want to leave. 2 weeks after the storm, Elena stood in her kitchen at midnight, staring at a shattered plate on the floor, and trying to make sense of what she had just seen. She had dropped a stack of dishes because Shadow, who had been lying calmly by the fireplace only seconds before, suddenly rose to his feet with every hair on his body standing rigid, a deep, threatening growl rolling from his chest as he stared fixedly at the darkened window facing the tree line. "Shadow, what is it?" He did not answer, of course. He never answered, not with words. But the intensity in his posture told her something was very wrong, and instinct sent her hand toward the kitchen knife on the counter before she even fully registered doing it. Outside, deep in the shadows of Silver Hollow Forest, 2 figures moved with careful, deliberate steps, scanning the tree line with the kind of focus that had nothing to do with wildlife watching. Owen Marsh and Callum Reyes had been tracking a trail for 11 days, a trail of scent and disturbed earth that had led them steadily closer to this small cottage at the edge of the woods, and both of them were beginning to suspect they had finally found what, or who, they were looking for. "You smell that?" Owen murmured, his eyes narrowing toward the lit windows of the cottage. "That's him. That's the Alpha's scent." Callum said nothing for a long moment, his jaw tight. He had been the one to lead the attack 2 weeks earlier, the one who had ordered the ambush on Kiandrak in the deep forest, and he had spent every day since convinced that the job had been finished, that the king was dead somewhere in the undergrowth, his body already claimed by scavengers. Finding out otherwise was not good news for anyone involved. "If he's alive," Callum said quietly, "he knows who came after him, which means we don't have the luxury of finishing this quietly anymore. There's a human in there," Owen pointed out. "A witness. That complicates things." Callum's eyes moved to the glowing windows of the cottage, to the shape of a woman, visible for a moment, behind the glass, and something cold settled into his expression. "It complicates things for her, not for us." Inside, Elena's grip on the knife handle tightened as Shadow's growling grew louder, more urgent, his body angling itself between her and the door in a way that made her chest tighten with something that was not quite fear and not quite gratitude, but some tangled combination of both. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I believe you. Something's out there." She moved to the window, careful to stay low, and peered out into the darkness. For a long moment, she saw nothing but trees and shadow, the kind of ordinary forest night she had grown used to over her years living out here alone. But then, just at the edge of her vision, she caught the faint outline of movement, 2 shapes retreating deeper into the tree line, and a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. "There were people out there," she said slowly, turning back to Shadow. "Actual people, in the middle of the night, in the middle of the forest." Shadow's growl finally quieted, though his body remained tense, his gold eyes still fixed on the window, even after the shapes had disappeared. Elena sat down heavily on the arm of the couch, her heart still hammering, and looked at him with a new kind of scrutiny. "You knew they were coming before I saw anything," she said. "You knew, and you weren't scared. You were angry, protective." She paused, studying him. "Shadow, what exactly are you?" It was not the first time she had asked the question, not really, though this was the first time she had asked it aloud with such deliberate weight behind it. In the 2 weeks since she had dragged him bleeding into her home, she had catalogued a growing list of things that did not add up. His unnatural size. His healing speed, which had taken him from near death to fully mobile in a matter of days, rather than the weeks it should have required. The way he seemed to understand not just simple commands, but entire conversations, responding with expressions and gestures that felt disturbingly close to human comprehension. She had told herself, each time, that there had to be a rational explanation, that she was simply anthropomorphizing an intelligent animal, seeing patterns where none existed, because loneliness, made her want a connection that could understand her back. But rational explanations were getting harder to hold on to. Shadow met her gaze, and for a moment, something in his expression looked almost like guilt, almost like the desire to explain himself, paired with the frustrating inability to do so. Then he crossed the room, slow and deliberate, and rested his head against her knee, a gesture of comfort that felt, more than anything, like an apology. "It's okay," Elena said softly, running her fingers through the thick fur at his neck, feeling the tension slowly bleed out of both of them. "You don't have to tell me. I trust you anyway. That's probably not smart, but I trust you anyway." Kian closed his eyes at the words and felt something in his chest tighten painfully. She trusted him, a creature who could, with a single shift, reveal himself as one of the most dangerous beings in the region. A man who had let her believe, for 2 weeks now, that he was nothing more than an injured wolf she had taken pity on. He had told himself, every day since the storm, that he would leave as soon as he was strong enough, that staying any longer than necessary was reckless, dangerous for her, and complicated for him. But every day he found a new reason to delay, and tonight, with the scent of Owen Marsh and Callum Reyes still lingering faintly on the night air, he understood with sudden clarity that his reasons had run out. His enemies had found him, and now they had found her too. He could not leave her here, unprotected, with 2 wolves who had already proven themselves willing to kill, circling closer to her home. But he also could not protect her properly while trapped in this form, unable to fully access his strength, unable to explain the danger she was in, or arm her against it. The choice, cruel as it was, had narrowed to one option. He needed to shift, and he needed to do it soon, whether or not he had fully prepared her, or himself, for the truth that would follow. The next morning, Elena called in sick to the clinic for the first time in 3 years, unable to shake the unsettled feeling that had followed her since the night before. She spent the day close to home, checking the windows more often than usual, keeping Shadow near her, even as she told herself she was being paranoid. "I know I sound crazy," she told him, sitting on the porch steps with a mug of tea going cold in her hands, watching the tree line with a wariness that felt foreign to her usually peaceful existence. "But I keep thinking about how you reacted last night. Like you knew exactly what those people were, like you were protecting me from something specific." Shadow sat beside her, his large body a warm, solid presence against her side, and said nothing, because there was nothing he could say. But he understood every word, and the growing awareness in her voice told him time was running shorter than he had hoped. "I looked something up," Elena continued, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. "Local folklore. There are old stories about this forest, about people who live in the deep woods who aren't entirely human. I always thought they were just stories, the kind of thing small towns tell to explain away strange noises at night." She paused, glancing at him sideways. "But you're not just a wolf, are you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with everything neither of them could fully articulate. Kian looked at her, really looked at her, at the intelligence and courage in her expression, even as fear flickered at its edges, and made a decision that would change both of their lives, irreversibly. Tonight. He would shift tonight, and tell her everything. The day passed slowly, filled with a tension Elena could not name but could not shake either. She busied herself with small chores, mending a torn curtain, reorganizing the pantry, anything to keep her hands occupied, while her mind circled endlessly around the strange events of the past weeks. Shadow followed her from room to room, with an unusual restlessness of his own, pacing occasionally, pausing at windows, behaving less like a recovering animal and more like someone bracing himself for a difficult conversation. As evening fell and the last light faded from the sky, Elena settled into her usual spot on the couch, a book open in her lap that she was not really reading, her attention instead fixed on Shadow, who had positioned himself by the fireplace with an odd stillness that felt deliberate. "You're acting strange tonight," she observed. "Stranger than usual, I mean." Shadow lifted his head and looked at her, and something in his gold eyes seemed almost pleading, almost apologetic, as though he were trying to warn her of something he had no way to explain. "Shadow?" And then, in the space of a single held breath, everything changed. Elena watched, frozen, as the wolf's body began to shift, fur receding into skin, bones rearranging themselves with a series of sounds that should have been horrifying, but happened too quickly, too fluidly, to fully process before it was already finished. Where her wolf had lain by the fireplace moments before, there now knelt a man, tall and powerfully built, dark hair falling across a face carved from sharp, striking lines, and eyes the exact same pale gold that had watched her for 2 weeks from behind an animal's face. The book slid from Elena's lap, forgotten, as she stared at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the impossible sight in front of her with everything she thought she understood about the world. "Elena," the man said, his voice low and rough, carrying an accent of authority she had somehow never noticed in his growls, but recognized instantly now that he spoke. "I need you to listen to me, and I promise I will explain everything. But right now, tonight, you and I are both in danger, and I could not protect you properly as I was." For a long moment, she said nothing at all, her breath coming in short, shallow pulls as every rational thought she had ever held about the world rearranged itself around the man kneeling in her living room. "Shadow," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Kian," he said gently, "Kian Drak, and I owe you a debt I do not know how to repay, because 2 weeks ago, you saved the life of the Alpha King of the Nightfall Pack, and you did it without knowing what I was, without asking anything in return, simply because you could not bear to watch something suffer." He paused, his gold eyes steady on hers, despite the vulnerability in them. "I am sorry, I did not tell you sooner. I am sorry for every lie of omission these past 2 weeks represented. But I am not sorry for the time I spent with you, and I need you to know that before anything else happens tonight." Elena's mind reeled, cycling through disbelief, fear, and something else entirely, something that felt disturbingly like the same tenderness she had built toward the wolf, now standing revealed as a man of considerable power and, apparently, considerable danger. "The people in the woods last night," she said slowly, piecing it together even through her shock. "They were looking for you." "Yes," Kian confirmed, "and I am afraid, now that they know I survived, they will not stop looking, which means, until I can deal with this properly, neither of us is safe here." Outside, unseen by either of them, Callum Reyes stood at the edge of the tree line once more, watching the cottage with narrowed eyes, having caught, even from this distance, the unmistakable surge of power that came from a king reclaiming his true form. He smiled, slow and cold, and melted back into the darkness to deliver the news to those waiting for it. The Alpha King was alive, and now, so was the opportunity to finish what had been started weeks before, in a way that would leave no survivors to tell the tale. Elena stood in the middle of her living room, staring at a man who, moments before, had been a wolf lying peacefully by her fireplace, and felt the entire architecture of her understanding about the world crumble and rebuild itself in real time. "Say something," Kian said quietly, watching her with careful patience, despite the urgency thrumming beneath his skin. "Anything. I would rather you scream at me than stand there in silence." "I fed you chicken from my own plate," Elena said faintly. "I read you an entire novel out loud because I thought you liked the sound of my voice." "I did like the sound of your voice," Kian admitted, and there was something almost boyish in the honesty of it, a crack in the composed authority he usually carried. "I liked it more than I probably should have." Elena pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to steady the spinning sensation behind her eyes. "You're a wolf. You're a person. You're a king, apparently, of some kind of pack that isn't just, what? A family of wolves living in the woods?" "The Nightfall Pack is a community," Kian explained, rising slowly to his feet, giving her space, rather than crowding her with his presence, though every instinct in him wanted to close the distance and offer comfort. "We live much like humans do, in our own hidden territories, with our own laws and our own history. We have lived alongside your kind for centuries without your knowledge, and most of us intend to keep it that way, for both our protection and yours." "And the people in the woods last night? The ones you growled at like they were about to burn the house down?" Kian's expression darkened, the warmth in his gold eyes hardening into something colder, more dangerous. "Wolves from within my own pack's broader territory. Ones who attacked me 2 weeks ago, the night you found me. I believed I had driven them off for good, I was wrong. Elena sank slowly onto the couch, her legs no longer entirely trustworthy beneath her. Why would your own people try to kill you? Power, Kian said simply, sitting across from her now, close enough to speak quietly, but far enough to respect the fragile trust still holding this conversation together. The position of Alpha King is not simply inherited and left unchallenged. There are those within Nightfall who believe leadership should belong to a different bloodline, a different philosophy. Most disagreements like this are settled through pack law, through challenge and contest. What happened to me in the forest was neither lawful nor honorable. It was an assassination attempt, carried out by wolves willing to break every rule our people hold sacred in order to seize power. And now they know you're alive. Now they know I'm alive, Kian confirmed grimly. Which means they also know I can identify at least one of them, and that changes everything about how dangerous the coming days will be. Men who have already crossed one line rarely hesitate to cross a second. Elena wrapped her arms around herself, feeling suddenly, deeply cold despite the fire still burning in the hearth. You're telling me I'm in danger because I helped you? Yes, Kian said, and there was no attempt to soften the truth, no comforting lie to ease her fear, only honest, painful clarity. I am telling you exactly that, because you deserve to understand the full weight of what has happened before you decide anything about what comes next. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly in the silence, and outside, the wind moved through the trees with a sound that, only weeks ago, Elena would have found peaceful and now found unbearably ominous. What happens next? She finally asked. What do you need from me? Kian studied her for a long moment, taking in the fear in her expression. Yes, but also the steadiness beneath it, the same quiet resolve that had led her to drag a bleeding wolf into her home, without a second thought for her own safety. I need you to trust me a little longer, he said. I know that is a great deal to ask of someone I have deceived, even unintentionally, for 2 weeks, but I intend to make certain you are protected, whatever it takes, and I would rather you understand every choice I make on your behalf, rather than simply having them made around you. And if I said I wanted nothing to do with any of this? If I asked you to leave and never come back? Something flickered across Kian's face, quick and painful, gone almost before Elena could name it. Then I would leave, he said quietly. Whatever protection I could offer from a distance, I would give, without requiring anything more of you than the chance to atone for placing you in danger in the first place. The honesty in his answer, the complete absence of manipulation or pressure, did more to settle Elena's racing thoughts than any argument could have. This was not a man trying to trap her into staying. This was, despite everything, someone genuinely willing to step back if that was what she needed. And somehow, that made her want to stay all the more. I'm not asking you to leave, she said slowly, surprising herself with the steadiness in her own voice. I'm scared, and I'm still trying to process the fact that I apparently gave belly rubs to a king, but I'm not asking you to leave. A small, genuine smile broke across Kian's face, softening the sharp lines of his features into something almost boyish. Belly rubs, he repeated, a note of dry amusement threading through his voice despite the gravity of the situation. I had wondered if you would remember that particular indignity. Oh, I remember all of it, Elena said, a hint of her usual humor finally surfacing through the shock. Every embarrassing thing I said to you, while you sat there understanding every word and saying nothing. In my defense, Kian said, I found the belly rubs quite pleasant. Despite herself, Elena laughed, a short, startled sound that broke some of the unbearable tension in the room, and for a moment, the impossible strangeness of the situation gave way to something almost normal, two people finding humor together in the aftermath of a life-altering revelation. Then, from somewhere out in the darkness beyond the cottage, a long, low howl rose into the night, and every trace of humor drained instantly from Kian's expression. They're closer than I thought, he said, rising swiftly to his feet, his entire demeanor shifting from warmth to sharp, focused alertness. Elena, I need you to listen carefully. Do you have somewhere safe you can go, somewhere away from here, tonight? My clinic has a back room with a lock, Elena said, already moving, adrenaline burning through the last of her shock. But Kian, if they're after you, wouldn't running just put me between you and them if they catch up? They will not catch up, Kian said, and there was a hardness in his voice now, a glimpse of the king who had ruled a powerful pack for 11 years, rather than the gentle wolf who had rested his head against her knee. Because I am not going to let them. Outside, in the deep shadows of Silver Hollow Forest, Callum Reyes stood alongside 4 other wolves, their eyes glinting in the moonlight, waiting for the signal that would send them converging on the small cottage at the forest's edge. Remember, Callum said quietly, addressing the wolves flanking him, the king is not to be underestimated, even weakened. We move together, or we do not move at all. Owen Marsh, standing at his shoulder, glanced toward the cottage's warm, glowing windows. With a flicker of unease he quickly buried. And the human? Callum's expression turned cold and final. The human made her choice the moment she chose to protect him, instead of calling for help like any sensible person would have. She is not our primary concern tonight, but if she becomes an obstacle, she will be treated as one. Back inside the cottage, Kian moved with swift, decisive purpose, retrieving Elena's car keys from the small bowl by the door where she always left them, pressing them into her hand with a firmness that left no room for argument. Take the car, drive to your clinic, lock the doors, and do not open them for anyone until I come for you myself. Do you understand? What about you? I am going to make certain they never find this cottage worth attacking in the first place, Kian said, and the resolve in his voice left no doubt in Elena's mind that he meant every word, whatever the cost. She hesitated at the door, keys clutched tightly in her hand, torn between the instinct to flee to safety and a fierce, unexpected reluctance to leave him behind to face danger alone. Kian, she said softly, please be careful. Something in his gold eyes softened, even as the tension of the coming confrontation remained etched across every line of his powerful frame. I intend to be. I have far too many reasons to survive the night, now that I did not have 2 weeks ago. Elena stepped out into the cold night air, climbed into her car with hands that trembled only slightly, and drove away from the cottage without looking back, though every instinct screamed at her to turn around. Behind her, in the shadows of the trees, 5 wolves began to close in on a cottage they believed still held their wounded, weakened target. They had no idea that the man waiting for them inside was neither wounded nor weak any longer, and that the gentle wolf who had accepted belly rubs from a kind-hearted stranger had, in this moment, fully reclaimed every ounce of the power that had made him Alpha King of the Nightfall Pack in the first place. The clinic's back room smelled like antiseptic and old coffee, and Elena sat on an overturned crate with her knees pulled to her chest, phone clutched uselessly in her hand because she had no one to call who would believe a single word of what had happened tonight. Every creak of the building settling sent her pulse spiking. Every gust of wind against the windows made her breath catch. She kept replaying the image of Kian's face in the firelight, the calm certainty in his voice when he told her to leave, and wondered, with a growing knot of dread in her stomach, whether she would ever see him again. Back at the cottage, Kian stood in the center of his own borrowed refuge, senses stretched wide across the darkness outside, counting the approaching presences with the practiced ease of a king who had spent over a decade learning to read danger before it arrived. 5 of them, Callum Reyes leading, flanked by 4 others whose scents he did not recognize individually, but whose intent was unmistakable. He did not wait for them to reach the door. Stepping out onto the porch, bare-chested against the cold night air, Kian let his true presence unfurl fully for the first time in weeks, the weight of authority and power that came with his bloodline rolling off him in a wave that stopped the approaching wolves in their tracks at the edge of the tree line. Callum, Kian said, his voice carrying easily across the distance, calm in a way that was far more unsettling than shouting would have been. I confess, I expected more creativity from you than a second attempt at the exact same failed strategy. Callum stepped forward from the shadows, shifting smoothly into his human form, dark eyes glinting with a mixture of surprise and calculation. He had not expected to find the king standing, whole and clearly recovered, waiting for them rather than cowering inside. You should be dead, Callum said flatly. I am aware that was the intention, Kian replied. I apologize for the inconvenience of my continued survival. This does not have to become a bloodbath, Callum said, though the tension coiled through his shoulders suggested he did not entirely believe his own words. Step down. Name me your successor, publicly, and I promise you a peaceful retreat from pack life. No further violence. You attacked me in the deep forest, left me for dead, and now you offer me a peaceful retreat, as though it were generosity. Qian said, something dangerous sharpening beneath his even tone. I think we both know that offer expires the moment I am no longer standing in front of you. Callum's jaw tightened. Then we do this the hard way. The four wolves flanking him surged forward, and Qian felt the familiar fierce clarity that came with combat settle over him like a second skin. He shifted mid-stride, fur and muscle replacing skin in the space of a single powerful leap, meeting the first attacker head-on with a force that sent them both tumbling across the frost-covered ground. The fight that followed was brutal but brief, Qian's superior strength and the fury of righteous anger fueling every movement. He fought not with the reckless fury of desperation, but with the controlled, decisive power of a king who had spent years earning his position through strength and skill rather than simply inheriting it. One attacker fell back, injured too badly to continue. Another retreated into the trees the moment the tide turned decisively against them. Owen Marsh, caught between loyalty to Callum and the sudden, undeniable proof that this fight was already lost, hesitated at the edge of the clearing, torn. Callum alone continued to press forward, driven by desperation now more than confidence, aware that failure tonight meant consequences far worse than simple defeat. You will not win this, Qian said, shifting back to his human form just long enough to speak, blood trickling from a shallow cut along his forearm, though nothing compared to the wounds he had carried 2 weeks before. Not tonight, and not through methods this dishonorable. Stand down, Callum, while you still have the chance to face pack justice rather than my personal judgment. For a long, tense moment, Callum stood frozen, calculating his odds and finding them worse with every passing second. Then, with a snarl of pure frustration, he turned and fled into the trees, Owen and the remaining wolves following swiftly behind him, the confrontation ending not with a decisive death, but with a retreat that left far too many questions unanswered. Qian remained standing in the clearing long after they had disappeared, breathing hard, the adrenaline of battle slowly draining away and leaving exhaustion in its wake. He had survived, the cottage was safe, but Callum remained free, and that meant the danger to Elena, to everyone connected to this conflict, was far from over. He needed to return to Nightfall territory. He needed to address his council, reassert his authority, and begin the difficult work of rooting out whatever conspiracy had grown deep enough within his own pack to produce an attempt on his life. But first, he needed to see her safely returned, needed to know with his own eyes that she was unharmed. The drive to the clinic felt endless to Elena, every mile stretching her nerves thinner, though in truth it was Qian who covered the distance, running through the forest in his wolf form faster than any vehicle could have managed, driven by an urgency that had little to do with duty and everything to do with the fear that had gripped him the moment she drove away. He found her exactly where he had told her to wait, curled in the back room of the clinic, eyes red-rimmed from unshed tears, and fear held tightly in check. When he knocked softly on the back door, calling her name in a voice she recognized instantly despite everything that had changed between them in the past few hours, she nearly knocked over a shelf of supplies in her rush to reach him. "You're alive," she breathed, opening the door to find him standing there, shirtless and bearing the marks of battle but very much alive, very much whole. "You're actually alive." "I told you I had reasons to survive the night," Qian said, and though exhaustion weighed heavily in his voice, warmth broke through it as she pulled him into an embrace that neither of them had quite anticipated, born entirely of relief, and something else neither was yet ready to name. "What happened?" she asked, stepping back to examine the cut along his forearm, with the practiced concern of someone used to tending wounds, though her hands trembled slightly as she did. "Callum retreated," Qian said, "for now. But this is not over, Elena. He knows I survived, and men desperate enough to attempt murder once rarely stop after a single failure." Elena absorbed this with a steadiness that surprised even herself, some part of her already adapting to a reality that, only hours before, would have seemed entirely impossible. "So what do we do now?" Qian studied her for a long moment, taking in the fierce, unwavering resolve in her expression, despite everything that had happened, and felt something in his chest settle into a certainty he had not expected to find so quickly. "Now," he said quietly, "I return to my pack, and I begin the work of ensuring this threat is dealt with properly, through pack law and full authority, rather than fought off piecemeal in the dark. And I would very much like it, Elena, if you would consider coming with me, at least until I know you are entirely safe from the fallout of everything that has happened. Into a hidden pack territory, full of wolves who might not exactly welcome a human showing up with their king," Elena said, arching an eyebrow despite the exhaustion evident in her posture. "Into a hidden pack territory," Kian confirmed, "where I promise you will be under my direct protection, and where, whatever else happens, you will finally have all your questions answered properly, rather than pieced together in the middle of a crisis." Elena considered this for a long moment, weighing fear against curiosity, danger against the strange, undeniable pull she felt toward this man who had spent 2 weeks as her wolf, and had now revealed himself as so much more. In the end, it was not really much of a choice at all. "Okay," she said finally. "Let's go meet your pack." Kian's answering smile, tired and battle-worn as he was, held more genuine warmth than Elena had seen from him yet, and for a moment, the danger and uncertainty of everything ahead faded into the background of a connection neither of them fully understood, but both were increasingly unwilling to walk away from. They left the clinic together as the first gray light of dawn began creeping over the horizon, unaware that in the depths of Nightfall territory, word of the failed attack had already begun spreading through the pack, and that Rhea, upon hearing the first whispered reports that her king was alive and returning, felt a relief so overwhelming it nearly brought her to her knees. Nightfall territory revealed itself slowly, the ordinary forest giving way, almost imperceptibly, to something older and stranger the deeper Elena and Kian traveled. Ancient trees grew taller and closer together, their canopies weaving into a natural ceiling that blocked most of the morning light, and the air itself seemed to hum with a quiet energy Elena could not name but felt in her bones. "It's beautiful," she said softly, walking beside Kian along a path that seemed to appear only for those meant to walk it. "It has been my home my entire life," Kian said, something like tentative pride in his voice, as he watched her take in the landscape with open wonder rather than fear. "Though I confess, I have never brought anyone from outside our world to see it before." Before Elena could respond, a figure emerged from the trees ahead, moving with the swift, purposeful stride of someone who had clearly been watching for their arrival. The woman was tall and striking, dark hair braided tightly away from a face set in an expression of fierce relief that broke, for just a moment, into something rawer as she took in the sight of her king walking toward her, alive and whole. "You are late," the woman said, though her voice cracked slightly on the words, betraying the depth of worry beneath the sharp greeting. 11 days, Kian. 11 days with no word, and I have spent every single one of them holding this pack together, with nothing but stubbornness and lies about your whereabouts." "Rhea," Kian said, and the warmth in his voice as he embraced her briefly was unmistakable, the bond of long friendship evident even to Elena's outsider eyes. "I am sorry, truly, I was not in a position to send word." Rhea's sharp gaze shifted to Elena, taking in every detail with the swift, assessing look of someone accustomed to evaluating threats and allies in equal measure. "And this is?" "Elena Voss," Kian said. "The woman who found me bleeding in the forest after Callum's attack and nursed me back to health without knowing what I was. I owe her my life, Rhea, in the most literal sense possible." Something shifted in Rhea's expression, surprise giving way to a grudging respect as she studied Elena more carefully. "A human, treating our wolf king like a stray dog for 2 weeks, entirely unaware of what she was housing. She fed me from her own plate," Kian said, a faint smile touching his lips, despite the gravity of the situation, "and gave me belly rubs, on at least one memorable occasion." Rhea's eyebrows rose sharply, and for the first time since their arrival, something like genuine amusement broke through her guarded composure. "I look forward to hearing that particular story in full detail." She turned back to Kian, sobering quickly. "The council has been restless in your absence, Kian. There have been whispers, dangerous ones, about the need for new leadership, You need to address them immediately, before Callum's allies within our walls can shape the narrative further in his favor. Kian's expression hardened, the brief warmth of reunion giving way to the sharp focus of a king facing political crisis. Then let us not waste any more time. He turned to Elena, something apologetic in his gaze, even as urgency pulled at him. I need to address my council. It will not be pleasant, and it may take some time. Rhea will see you settled somewhere safe and comfortable, while I handle this. I can take care of myself, Elena said, though there was no real protest in her tone, only understanding of the weight of what he needed to do. I know, Kian said quietly. That has never been in question. But allow me this, please. I would like to know you are safe, while I deal with matters that are, unfortunately, entirely my responsibility to handle alone. Elena nodded, and Rhea, watching the exchange with sharp, curious eyes, found herself re-evaluating her initial assumptions about this human woman her king had brought into their midst. There was something steady about her, something unshaken despite clearly finding herself in a situation entirely beyond anything she could have prepared for. As Kian strode off toward the heart of Nightfall territory, Rhea led Elena toward a smaller dwelling near her own, offering quiet, practical hospitality that gradually gave way to genuine conversation as the hours passed. He does not bring people here, Rhea said eventually, settling across from Elena with 2 cups of something warm and fragrant that Elena did not recognize but drank gratefully anyway. Not humans, and honestly, not many wolves either, beyond those who already belong to this territory. Kian keeps his circle small. He always has. Why? Elena asked. Rhea considered the question for a long moment, weighing how much to share with a stranger who had, admittedly, already proven herself trustworthy in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Because being Alpha King means every relationship carries weight. Every friendship is scrutinized for political advantage. Every kindness is questioned for hidden motive. It is a lonely position, more lonely than most people realize, and Kian learned very young to guard himself carefully against those who might exploit closeness to him. She paused, studying Elena with new interest. Which makes the fact that he brought you here, so quickly, so openly, rather remarkable. Elena absorbed this in silence, thinking of the 2 weeks she had spent talking to a wolf she believed could not understand a single word, sharing pieces of herself she had never offered to another living soul, entirely unaware that the creature listening was carrying the same isolation Rhea now described, and finding, in her company, a rare relief from it. He never told me any of that, Elena said softly. Not directly, but I think, somehow, I understood it anyway. There was something in the way he listened, even before I knew he could actually understand me. Like he needed someone to just talk to him, without expecting anything back. Rhea's expression softened further, whatever lingering wariness she had carried toward this human woman, dissolving into something closer to genuine warmth. Then perhaps you understand him better than most who have known him for years. Meanwhile, in the heart of Nightfall territory, Kian stood before his assembled council, a gathering of pack elders and representatives, whose faces reflected a complicated mixture of relief, suspicion, and calculation in equal measure. I understand there have been questions raised about my continued leadership during my absence, Kian said, his voice carrying the calm, unshakable authority that had earned him his position over a decade earlier. I am here to answer them directly, and I will not pretend the events of the past weeks have been anything less than a serious breach of pack law and safety. An elder named Edwin, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, one of the more vocal skeptics during Kian's absence, rose slowly from his seat. We are relieved to see you returned, Alpha King, but 11 days is a long silence, and silence breeds doubt. Some among us wondered if your leadership had grown too complacent, if the attack against you succeeded, in part, because vigilance had lapsed. The attack succeeded, Kian said evenly, because it was carried out by wolves willing to violate every honor code our people hold sacred, launched without warning or lawful challenge. I do not intend to let that violation go unanswered, nor do I intend to let questions of my competency distract from identifying and addressing the true threat that still exists within our ranks. And do you know who is responsible? Edwin pressed. Callum Reyes, Kian said, the name landing heavily across the assembled council, several members exchanging sharp, uneasy glances, along with Owen Marsh, and at least 3 others whose identities I intend to fully confirm in the coming days. This was not a spontaneous act of violence, Edwin. This was planned, coordinated, and I have reason to believe it was not carried out without support from within these very walls. The council erupted into a low murmur of shock and unease, and Kian let the weight of his accusations settle fully before continuing. I will find whoever provided that support, he said, his voice hardening into something colder and more dangerous than the council had heard from their king in years. And when I do, they will face the full weight of pack justice, regardless of their position or standing among us. This is not a threat, it is a promise. Edwin sank back into his seat, and around the chamber, several council members shifted uncomfortably, aware, perhaps for the first time, of just how thoroughly their king intended to root out the conspiracy that had nearly cost him his life. By the time Kian finally returned to the small dwelling where Rhea had settled Elena, evening had fallen fully across Nightfall territory, and exhaustion had etched deep lines across his features, despite the strength of his authority holding firm throughout the confrontation. How did it go? Elena asked, rising to meet him as he entered. As well as could be expected, Kian said, and something in the way he allowed himself to simply exist in her presence, shoulders finally dropping their careful, guarded posture, spoke volumes about the toll the day had taken. I have made my intentions clear. Whether that is enough to smoke out whoever within my own council supported Callum's betrayal remains to be seen. Elena studied him for a long moment, taking in the weariness beneath his composed exterior, and felt an unexpected surge of tenderness that startled her with its intensity. You look like you need to sit down and eat something, and maybe stop being a king for about 10 minutes. A tired laugh escaped him, genuine and warm despite everything. Is that an order? Consider it a strong suggestion from someone who has apparently been treating you like a house pet without fully appreciating the irony of that dynamic until just now. Kian's answering smile held none of the careful political calculation he had worn throughout the day, only the same quiet warmth she had first glimpsed in the eyes of an injured wolf lying by her fireplace, and as they settled together to share a simple meal, the growing weight of political danger and looming betrayal faded, briefly, into the background of something far simpler and far more precious than either of them had expected to find in the wreckage of an assassination attempt. Life within Nightfall territory settled, over the following days, into a rhythm that felt strange to Elena in its normalcy, given everything that had led her there. She woke each morning to birdsong filtering through ancient trees, spent her days exploring the hidden world Kian had grown up in, and found herself, more and more, drawn into conversations and moments with him that had nothing to do with danger or politics, and everything to do with simply learning who he was as a person, rather than as a title. You never told me what it was like, she said one afternoon, sitting beside him on a smooth outcropping of rock overlooking a quiet stream that wound through the heart of the territory. Growing up as the son of an alpha king, I imagine it wasn't exactly a normal childhood. Kian considered the question, watching the water move over stones worn smooth by centuries of steady current. It was lonely, mostly. My father believed strength came from solitude, from learning to rely on nothing but yourself. I was trained in combat and leadership from the time I could walk, and encouraged, quite deliberately, to keep my distance from anyone who might one day become a liability. That sounds exhausting, Elena said softly. It was, Kian admitted, though I did not fully understand how exhausting until I spent 2 weeks lying by your fireplace, being fed by hand and read to like a beloved pet, with absolutely no expectation placed on me beyond simply existing. A faint, genuine smile touched his lips. I had forgotten what that felt like, if I ever truly knew it at all. Elena studied him, something warm and aching blooming in her chest at the quiet vulnerability in his admission. For what it's worth, I think you're a good king. From everything I've seen, everyone here respects you. Rhea clearly adores you, in her own gruff way. Rhea adores very few things, Kian said, amusement threading through his voice. You should feel honored to have earned a place on that very short list within a matter of days. Their conversation drifted easily from there, filling the afternoon with the kind of unhurried intimacy that had been building steadily between them since the night of the storm, long before either of them had understood what it truly meant. Elena found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, and Kian, watching her animated expressions and listening to her easy humor, felt the last of his careful guardedness dissolve entirely in her presence. It was Ria who found them there as evening approached, her expression carrying a seriousness that immediately cut through the peaceful mood of the afternoon. "Kian," she said, her voice tight with barely contained urgency. "We have a problem." Kian rose immediately, the relaxed warmth of moments before, replaced instantly by sharp, focused attention. "What happened?" "Word has reached us that Callum has been recruiting outside our territory," Ria said. "Rogue wolves. Wolves with no pack loyalty, who owe nothing to Nightfall law or tradition. He is building support beyond our borders, preparing for something larger than another simple assassination attempt." "An uprising," Kian said grimly. "That is my assessment as well," Ria confirmed. "And there is something else." She hesitated, glancing briefly at Elena before continuing. "One of my scouts spotted unfamiliar wolves near the edge of Silver Hollow Forest, close to Elena's cottage. It may be nothing, but given everything else, I did not want to take the risk of assuming so." Elena's stomach dropped. "They know where I live. It appears so," Ria said grimly. Kian's expression darkened with a fury that Elena had not seen from him before, something fierce and protective that radiated off him in waves. "If Callum believes threatening Elena will pressure me into any kind of concession, he has fundamentally misjudged exactly what kind of response that will provoke. We need to increase security around the territory borders immediately," Ria said. "And Elena should not leave Nightfall grounds until this threat is fully neutralized." Elena, despite the fear tightening in her chest, felt a flare of frustration at being discussed, as though she were simply a problem to be managed, rather than a person capable of making her own choices. "I appreciate everyone's concern, but I would like to actually be part of this conversation, not just a topic within it." Kian turned to her immediately, something apologetic in his gaze even amid the tension of the moment. "You are right. I apologize. What are your thoughts?" The direct question, so genuinely offered, softened Elena's frustration considerably. "I think," she said slowly, "that hiding isn't going to make Callum stop targeting me. If anything, it might convince him I'm valuable enough as leverage to keep pursuing. But I also understand I'm not equipped to fight wolves in the forest, so I'm open to reasonable precautions that don't just involve locking me away somewhere and hoping for the best." Ria's expression shifted into something like respect at the clear-eyed practicality of Elena's response. "She has a fair point, Kian. And for what it's worth, I would rather have someone who understands the stakes working with us than someone we are forced to constantly manage around." Kian considered this for a long moment, the protective instinct warring visibly with genuine respect for Elena's autonomy and clear thinking. Finally, he nodded. "Then we plan together. But Elena, I need you to understand that Callum has already proven himself willing to kill without hesitation. This is not a threat I am willing to treat lightly, regardless of how capable you are." "I understand," Elena said quietly. "Believe me, I understand exactly how serious this is." That night, as Nightfall territory settled into a tense, watchful quiet, Elena had been staying, unable to fully shake the fear that had gripped him since learning of the threat against her. When she opened the door to find him there, something in his expression, raw and unguarded in a way she had rarely seen, made her step aside wordlessly to let him in. "I cannot lose you," Kian said quietly, the admission clearly costing him something significant to voice aloud. "I have faced death before, Elena. I have led wolves into battle and buried friends lost to violence and betrayal. But the thought of losing you, of Callum using you against me, terrifies me in a way nothing else in 11 years of leadership ever has." Elena crossed the small distance between them, reaching up to gently cup his face in her hands, feeling the tension held tight in his jaw beneath her palms. "You're not going to lose me. We're going to get through this, together, because that's what we do now, apparently. We take care of each other." Kian closed his eyes briefly at her touch, leaning into it with a vulnerability that felt like the truest version of himself she had seen yet, stripped entirely of the careful authority he wore for his pack and council. 2 weeks ago, I was a stranger, bleeding in your living room. I have no right to feel what I feel for you, not after such a short time, not given everything I still have not properly explained about the dangers of this world. Kian, Elena said softly, I spent 2 weeks talking to a wolf about every private thought I've ever had, trusting him completely without knowing why, and it turned out, I was talking to you the entire time. I don't think what's between us follows any normal timeline. I think it just is what it is. Something in Kian's expression broke open at her words, the last of his careful restraint giving way, and when he leaned down to close the distance between them, Elena met him halfway, the kiss soft and searching, and carrying the weight of everything unspoken between them since the night of the storm. When they finally parted, foreheads resting together, Kian's voice was rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide. Whatever happens with Callum, whatever comes next, I want you to know that these past weeks with you have been the first time in my entire life I have felt like more than simply a title. You've always been more than that to me, Elena said softly, since the very first night, when I saw a wolf bleeding in the storm and couldn't bring myself to walk away. Outside, the forest remained watchful and quiet, but within the small dwelling, two people who had found each other through the strangest of circumstances allowed themselves, for one night, to simply exist together in the warmth of a connection neither fully understood, but both were no longer willing to deny. The danger waiting beyond Nightfall's borders had not disappeared. If anything, it drew closer with each passing day, Callum's growing army of rogue wolves gathering strength in the shadows. But for tonight, at least, Kian and Elena allowed themselves the fragile, precious gift of choosing each other fully, whatever uncertain future awaited them both. 3 days later, Ria called an emergency gathering of Kian's closest advisors, her expression grim as she laid a small, tarnished pendant on the table before them. One of the border scouts found this near the eastern boundary, she said. It belongs to Edwin. Kian stared at the pendant, a slow, cold understanding settling over him. Edwin, the silver-haired elder who had questioned his leadership so pointedly upon his return, who had sat on the council for over 20 years, and whose loyalty Kian had never once thought to question. You believe Edwin has been aiding Callum, Kian said, though it was less a question than a statement, the pieces of the past weeks rearranging themselves into a picture he did not want to see, but could no longer ignore. I believe it is more than possible, Ria said. The scout found signs of a meeting near that boundary 2 nights ago, wolves moving in and out of Nightfall territory without authorization. Edwin's pendant was found at the site. He questioned my leadership the moment I returned, Kian said slowly. He pushed hardest for doubt about my competency, about whether the attack succeeded because of some failure on my part rather than Callum's betrayal. I assumed it was simple political maneuvering. I did not consider it might be something far more deliberate. There is one way to know for certain, Ria said. Confront him directly. If he is innocent, he deserves the chance to clear his name. If he is guilty, better we know now, before Callum's forces grow any stronger. Elena, seated quietly at the edge of the gathering, watched the tension ripple through the room and felt a fresh wave of unease settle over her. This was not simply a matter of outside enemies anymore. The betrayal had reached into the very heart of Kian's leadership, into the council he was supposed to be able to trust above all others. I will speak with him tonight, Kian said, his voice carrying a hard edge that Elena had come to recognize as the sound of the king beneath the man she had grown to love. Privately, before this becomes public knowledge that could fracture the council further. The confrontation, when it came, unfolded in Edwin's private quarters, the elder's initial composure cracking swiftly under the weight of Kian's direct accusation and the damning evidence of the pendant placed deliberately on the table between them. I did not intend for you to be killed, Edwin finally admitted, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and something that sounded almost like relief at finally confessing the weight he had been carrying. Callum promised only a challenge, a lawful contest for leadership that would force change without bloodshed. When it became clear he intended something far more permanent, I tried to distance myself, but by then, I was already too deeply involved to simply walk away. You helped him plan an assassination, Kian said, his voice deadly quiet. Whatever promises he made you, Edwin, you knew exactly what you were risking. I believe the pack needed change, Edwin said, some of his old defiance returning even now. Your father ruled through fear, and you, despite your efforts to be different, still hold that same isolated distance from those you lead. Callum promised a new vision, one built on connection rather than solitary strength. And instead, you gave him the information he needed to nearly succeed in murdering your king, Kian said. Whatever vision he promised you, Edwin, he has shown his true nature clearly enough now. He does not care about connection or vision. He cares about power, and he was willing to slaughter me in the deep forest to claim it. Edwin's face crumpled, the full weight of his choices finally settling over him. What happens now? You will face pack justice, Kian said. A fair judgment, weighing your confession and your attempt to distance yourself from Callum's final betrayal against the severity of your initial complicity. But first, Edwin, you are going to tell me everything you know about Callum's current plans, his forces, his timeline. If there is any chance of preventing further bloodshed, I need that information now. Edwin, broken and resigned, told him everything. Callum had spent the past weeks gathering not just rogue wolves without pack loyalty, but recruiting disillusioned members from several neighboring territories, promising them all a new order under his leadership. His forces, while still smaller than Nightfall's full strength, had grown considerably, and Edwin's information suggested Callum intended to strike within days, believing that a swift, decisive assault before Nightfall could fully mobilize its defenses offered his best chance at success. More troubling still was Edwin's final revelation. Callum knew about Elena, knew that she had become important to Kian, and viewed her as a potential weapon to be used, either as leverage to force Kian's surrender or as bait to draw him into a vulnerable position. When Kian relayed this information to Rhea and his closest advisors that night, the weight of it settled heavily across the gathered group. We increase security around Elena immediately, Rhea said without hesitation. And we begin preparing our own defenses. If Callum intends to strike soon, we cannot afford to be caught unprepared a second time. I want to help, Elena said, her voice steady, despite the fear tightening in her chest at hearing herself discussed as a target once again. I'm not asking to be put on the front lines of a fight against wolves, but there has to be something useful I can contribute, rather than simply waiting to be protected. Kian looked at her for a long moment, torn between the fierce protective instinct that wanted to shield her from every possible danger, and the genuine respect he held for her capability and courage. Your medical knowledge could prove valuable, he said finally. If this comes to conflict, we will need someone skilled in tending wounds, and your experience, while built on treating animals, translates more closely to our physiology than you might expect. I can do that, Elena said immediately, relief evident in her voice at having a concrete way to contribute, rather than simply waiting helplessly on the sidelines. As the gathering dispersed to begin the urgent work of preparing Nightfall's defenses, Kian pulled Elena aside, his expression softening from the hardened focus of a king planning for war into something more personal and afraid. I need you to promise me something, he said quietly. What? If this battle comes, and it becomes too dangerous, promise me you will prioritize your own safety over any attempt to help. I know you want to contribute, and I am grateful for that, more than I can properly express. But if choosing between tending a wound and protecting yourself ever becomes a genuine choice, Elena, please, choose yourself. Elena reached up to touch his face gently, seeing the raw fear beneath his composed exterior. Fear not for himself, but entirely for her. I promise to be careful, but Kian, I need you to understand something too. I'm not running from this, not anymore. Whatever happens, I'm staying, and I'm helping however I can, because that's who I am, and it's who I've always been, long before I knew what you really were. Kian pulled her into an embrace that spoke more clearly than any words could of everything building between them. Gratitude, and fear, and love, all tangled together in the quiet urgency of the moment. Outside, Nightfall territory buzzed with the low, focused energy of preparation. Wolves moving through the forest reinforcing boundaries, sharpening old alliances, readying themselves for a confrontation that all of them now understood was no longer a matter of if, but simply when. And somewhere beyond those borders, Callum Reyes stood before his own gathered forces, rogue wolves and disillusioned pack members, united under a promise of new leadership, preparing to march on Nightfall territory with a confidence built on the belief that surprise and numbers would finally succeed where his first attempt had failed. He did not yet know that Edwin's confession had stripped away his greatest advantage. He did not know that Kian Drak, the king he had left for dead in the forest weeks before, now stood fully healed, fully prepared, and fully determined to protect not only his pack, but the woman who had, against every possible odds, become the truest thing in his entire life. 2 days passed in a blur of preparation, Nightfall territory transforming from the peaceful, hidden sanctuary Elena had first walked into something closer to a fortress bracing for impact. Wolves patrolled the boundaries in coordinated shifts, weapons and strategies were discussed in low, urgent voices, and Elena found herself absorbed into the practical work of organizing medical supplies, her clinical training proving surprisingly adaptable to the needs of a species she had, only weeks before, believed to be nothing more than ordinary wildlife. "You are a natural at this," Rhea observed, watching Elena efficiently sort and label supplies with the same focused competence she had shown treating Kian's wounds on the night of the storm. "Kian chose well, whatever the circumstances of how you two found each other." "I don't feel like I chose anything," Elena admitted, not looking up from her work. "I just saw something bleeding and couldn't walk away. Everything since then has just kind of happened to me." "Sometimes the most important choices in our lives don't feel like choices at all," Rhea said. "They simply feel like the only possible response to what is right in front of us. That does not make them any less significant." Elena considered this, thinking of the storm, of the moment she had stepped off her porch into the rain, rather than locking her door and calling for help. It had not felt like a choice then. It had simply felt like the only thing she could have done, but it had changed the entire course of her life, and she found, sorting supplies in preparation for a battle against wolves who wanted to kill the man she loved, that she would not have changed a single moment of it. The attack, when it finally came, arrived not with the coordinated stealth Callum had planned, but with the desperate urgency of a leader who understood his advantage of surprise had already been lost. Word reached Nightfall's outer sentries just after midnight, a mass of unfamiliar wolves moving swiftly through the forest toward the territory's eastern boundary, far larger in number than even Edwin's warnings had suggested. "They're coming," Rhea said, bursting into the gathering hall where Kian stood, reviewing final defensive positions with his most trusted commanders. "Faster than we anticipated. Callum must have accelerated his timeline once he realized we knew about Edwin." Kian's expression hardened into the sharp, focused calm of a leader, facing exactly the crisis he had spent days preparing for. "Sound the full alert, every able wolf to their designated positions. And Rhea, ensure Elena is moved to the medical shelter immediately, with a guard posted at all times." The next hours passed for Elena in a haze of controlled chaos, the medical shelter filling steadily with the sounds of battle raging beyond its walls, distant howls and the sharper, more violent sounds of combat carrying through the forest air. She worked alongside 2 of Nightfall's healers, treating the wounded who were brought in with steadily increasing frequency as the conflict intensified, her hands remaining steady, even as fear for Kian gripped her chest with every passing minute he remained out of sight. "How is he?" she asked one of the healers, a quiet, capable woman named Petra, during a brief lull between arrivals. "Do you know how the fighting is going?" "The Alpha King fights at the front lines," Petra said, tending to a gash along a young wolf's shoulder with practiced efficiency. "He always has. It is part of why Nightfall's forces remain so loyal to him, whatever whispers of political discontent exist among the council. He does not ask his people to face danger he is unwilling to face himself." The knowledge offered little comfort to Elena, who understood all too well that leading from the front lines also meant facing the greatest danger, and it took every ounce of self-control she possessed not to abandon her post and search for him herself. Outside, the battle had reached its most brutal, decisive phase. Kian fought with the ferocious skill of 11 years spent honing his combat abilities, cutting through Callum's forces with a combination of raw strength and tactical precision that steadily turned the tide in Nightfall's favor. But Callum's rogue wolves, unbound by the honor codes that governed lawful pack conflict, fought with a desperate savagery that made every exchange dangerous, in ways traditional combat rarely was. It was Rhea who first spotted Owen Marsh breaking away from the main conflict, moving with deliberate purpose toward the territory's interior, rather than continuing to engage Nightfall's defenders directly. "He's heading toward the medical shelter," Rhea realized with a jolt of horror, understanding instantly that Owen's target was not strategic ground, but something, or someone, far more personal. She broke off from her own position and pursued him through the trees, but Owen had gained too significant a head start, and by the time Rhea reached the outskirts of the medical shelter, he had already slipped past the outer guard through a gap in the defensive perimeter, left thin by the demands of the wider battle. Inside, Elena had just finished treating another wounded wolf when the door burst open, and Owen Marsh stood in the entrance, blood-streaked and wild-eyed, his gaze fixing on her with an intent that sent ice through her veins. "You're the reason he survived," Owen said, advancing slowly into the shelter, the wounded wolves nearby too injured or too far to intervene effectively. "If Callum can't win this fight through numbers, perhaps he can win it through leverage." Elena backed away, her heart pounding, her mind racing for any possible advantage in a situation that offered her almost none. "Kian will kill you the moment he learns what you've done. Kian has to survive this battle first," Owen said grimly, closing the distance between them with predatory purpose. "And I suspect he will fight considerably less effectively once he learns his precious human has been taken." Elena's hand closed around the nearest object within reach, a heavy metal instrument tray, and she swung it with every ounce of strength and adrenaline coursing through her, catching Owen across the temple, in a strike that staggered him just enough to buy her precious seconds. It was not enough. Owen recovered quickly, snarling with pain and fury, and lunged toward her with clear intent to subdue her by force. But before he could close the final distance, Rhea crashed through the shelter's entrance, shifting mid-motion into her full wolf form, and slamming into Owen with a force that sent them both tumbling across the ground in a violent tangle of fur and fury. The fight between them was swift and decisive, Rhea's superior skill and righteous fury overwhelming Owen's desperate, flagging resistance within moments. When it ended, Owen lay subdued and bleeding on the shelter floor, and Rhea shifted back to her human form, breathing hard, immediately turning to Elena with sharp concern. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay," Elena said shakily, though her hands trembled visibly as the adrenaline of the encounter began to fade. "Thank you, Rhea, truly. Kian would never forgive either of us if something happened to you," Rhea said, already moving to secure Owen with the efficient practicality of someone accustomed to handling crisis. "Stay close to me for the remainder of this conflict. I am not leaving you unguarded again." Beyond the medical shelter, the tide of battle had turned decisively in Nightfall's favor, Callum's forces breaking under the combined weight of Kian's leadership and the fierce loyalty of wolves defending their home and their king. As dawn began breaking over the forest, the last remnants of Callum's rebellion scattered into retreat, leaving their leader increasingly isolated against Kian's advancing forces. Kian found Callum alone at the edge of Nightfall's boundary, breathing hard, blood streaked across his features. The desperate calculation of a man who understood his rebellion had failed, etched clearly into his expression. "It's over, Callum," Kian said, standing tall despite the exhaustion of a night's brutal combat, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a king who had, once again, proven himself capable of protecting everything and everyone under his care. "Your forces have scattered. Edwin has confessed. There is nowhere left for you to run that Nightfall's reach cannot follow." Callum's eyes, wild with the desperation of total defeat, flickered toward the forest as though calculating one final, futile escape. Then, with a snarl of pure frustrated rage, he made his choice, and the confrontation that followed was swift and absolute, ending not with negotiation, but with the final, decisive resolution that pack law demanded for crimes as severe as attempted regicide and rebellion. When it was finished, Kian stood alone in the gray light of dawn, breathing hard, the weight of the night's violence settling heavily across his shoulders. But beneath the exhaustion, a single thought burned clear and urgent above all others. Elena. He needed to know she was safe. The medical shelter had grown quiet by the time Kian arrived, the frantic energy of the night's battle giving way to the exhausted stillness of its aftermath. He pushed through the entrance, still bearing the marks of combat, and felt every fragment of tension leave his body at the sight of Elena standing near the back of the room, unharmed, alive, turning at the sound of his entrance with an expression of pure relief. "Kian." She crossed the room quickly, and he met her halfway, pulling her into an embrace that spoke of every fear he had carried through the long hours of battle, every desperate hope that she would still be standing here, waiting for him when it finally ended. "Ria told me what happened," Kian said, pulling back just enough to search her face for any sign of injury, his hands gentle, despite the visible strain of the night's violence still evident in his posture. "Owen came for you." "Ria saved me," Elena said. "I'm okay, Kian. Really, are you hurt?" "Nothing that will not heal," Kian said, though the haunted look in his gold eyes suggested the wounds that concerned him most had nothing to do with his own body. "Elena, when I learned Owen had broken through to the medical shelter, I have never in my life felt fear like that. Not facing Callum's entire rebellion, not even the night I nearly died in the forest. The thought of losing you was unlike anything I have ever experienced." Elena reached up to cup his face gently, feeling the exhaustion and lingering fear held tight in every line of his expression. "I'm here. We're both here. It's over now, isn't it?" "Callum's rebellion has been defeated," Kian confirmed. "Callum himself will no longer threaten Nightfall, or anyone connected to it. Edwin will face pack justice for his role in the conspiracy, though his cooperation in exposing Callum's plans will be weighed in his judgment. Owen and the remaining rebels who survive will face their own reckoning through proper pack law." He paused, something more vulnerable entering his voice. "It is over, Elena. For the first time in weeks, I can finally say that with certainty." Relief washed over Elena so completely that her knees nearly buckled, and Kian caught her easily, holding her steady as the full weight of the past weeks finally began to release its grip on both of them. In the days that followed, Nightfall territory slowly returned to something resembling its former peace, though the events of Callum's rebellion left lasting changes in their wake. The council, chastened by the discovery of Edwin's betrayal, moved swiftly to reaffirm their support for Kian's leadership, understanding now, more clearly than ever, the value of unity in the face of external and internal threats alike. Ria, whose swift action had saved Elena's life during the chaos of the final battle, found herself regarded with even greater respect throughout the pack, her position as second in command more secure and celebrated than it had ever been. And Elena, who had arrived in Nightfall territory as a frightened outsider, thrust suddenly into a hidden world of danger and power struggles, found herself, gradually, welcomed as something far more significant to the community she had helped protect. "The council wishes to formally thank you," Kian told her one evening, several days after the battle's end, as they walked together along the same quiet stream where they had first spoken openly of his lonely childhood weeks before. "For your role in tending the wounded, and for the courage you showed facing Owen without any true means of defending yourself." "I just did what needed doing," Elena said, though warmth colored her cheeks at the acknowledgement, the same as anyone would have. "Not everyone would have swung a metal tray at an attacking wolf with such conviction," Kian said, amusement warming his voice despite the gravity of the memory. "Ria has told the story at least a dozen times now, always with growing admiration for your fighting spirit." Elena laughed, some of the lingering tension from the past weeks finally beginning to ease from her shoulders. "I suppose I've officially become part of pack legend now." "You became part of something far more significant than legend the moment you chose to stay by my side through all of this," Kian said, stopping their walk to turn and face her fully, something deeply serious settling into his gold eyes despite the softness of his tone. "Elena, I have spent my entire life believing love and leadership could not coexist, that the isolation my father taught me was simply the necessary price of holding power. You have shown me, in the span of a few short weeks, exactly how wrong that belief was." Elena's breath caught at the raw sincerity in his voice, understanding, even before he continued, the significance of what was building in this quiet moment between them. "I do not simply want you to remain here because it is safer than returning to your old life," Kian continued. "I want you to remain because I love you, entirely and without reservation, in a way I did not believe myself capable of feeling for anyone. You saw me first as a wolf, without title or power, and chose kindness anyway. Then you saw me as a king, with all the danger and responsibility that entails, and chose to stay anyway. I do not know what I did to deserve such an extraordinary gift, but I am not foolish enough to let it go without asking you, properly, to remain by my side. Tears gathered in Elena's eyes, born entirely of joy, rather than the fear and uncertainty that had colored so much of the past weeks. Kian, I fell in love with you when I thought you were just an injured wolf who happened to be a very good listener. Finding out you were also a king, with an entire hidden world I never knew existed, didn't change how I felt. It just gave me a much bigger, much stranger world to fall in love with alongside you. Kian's answering smile held none of the careful restraint he had once worn as protection against vulnerability, only complete, unguarded happiness. Then stay, not simply as a guest under my protection, but as my equal, my partner, and, if you will have me, my mate. In every sense our world holds sacred. Yes, Elena said, the word emerging without hesitation, carrying the full weight of everything she had come to understand about her own heart over the past extraordinary weeks. Yes, Kian, I'll stay. The kiss that followed carried none of the uncertainty or urgency of their first, born instead of quiet, absolute certainty, two people who had found each other through the strangest possible circumstances, finally allowing themselves to fully embrace the future stretching out before them. Word of their commitment spread quickly through Nightfall territory, and in the days that followed, Elena found herself increasingly embraced, not as an outsider tolerated for her king's sake, but as a genuine and valued member of the community she had helped defend. Rhea, in particular, took evident satisfaction in the growing bond, treating Elena with the easy warmth of true friendship rather than cautious courtesy. You know, Rhea said one afternoon, watching Elena help organize the territory's medical supplies with the same quiet competence she had shown from the very beginning. When Kian first told me a human had nursed him back to health without knowing what he was, I assumed we would need to handle the situation delicately, perhaps arrange for your memory to be carefully managed once his recovery was complete. Elena glanced up, startled. That's possible? Managing memories? It is in certain circumstances, Rhea admitted. But watching you these past weeks, watching how thoroughly you've adapted, how fiercely you've fought for this pack's safety despite having no obligation to do so, I understand now why Kian refused to even consider that option. You do not belong to a memory that could simply be erased and forgotten. You belong here, exactly as you are, exactly as you have proven yourself to be. The words settled warmly in Elena's chest, another piece of confirmation that the extraordinary, impossible path her life had taken since that stormy night was not a mistake or an accident, but something she had, in her own quiet, courageous way, earned entirely on her own merit. The ceremony that marked Elena's formal acceptance into Nightfall took place beneath the ancient trees at the heart of the territory, a gathering of the entire pack assembled to witness a tradition few among them had ever expected to see extended to someone born entirely outside their hidden world. Elena stood at the center of the clearing, dressed simply but elegantly in fabric, woven with patterns Rhea had explained represented protection and loyalty, feeling the weight of hundreds of curious, watchful eyes upon her, without the fear such attention might once have inspired. Weeks ago, she had been a woman who valued her solitude above almost everything else, who had built a quiet, careful life, specifically designed to avoid this kind of exposure and vulnerability. Now, she stood in the center of an entire community, and found she welcomed their attention rather than fearing it. Kian approached from across the clearing, dressed in ceremonial attire that marked his full authority as Alpha King, and though Elena had grown accustomed to his power and presence over the past weeks, something in this formal setting reminded her freshly of exactly how significant a figure he was within this world, and exactly how significant a step they were both taking in choosing this path together. Elena Voss, Kian said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled pack, formal in a way that still somehow retained the warmth she had come to know so intimately. You found me broken and dying in a storm, and asked nothing of me beyond the chance to ease your suffering. You gave me kindness without condition, trust without explanation, and love without any promise of return. In doing so, you showed this entire pack, myself included, what true strength looks like when it is rooted not in power or fear, but in compassion freely given." He extended his hand, and Elena stepped forward to take it, feeling the warmth and steadiness of his grip anchor her fully in this moment. "Before this pack, and before the ancient bonds that have guided Nightfall for generations," Kian continued, "I claim Elena Voss as my equal, my partner, and my mate, and I ask this pack to recognize her, not as an outsider granted temporary shelter, but as a permanent and valued member of our community, deserving of every protection and honor we extend to one another." A murmur of assent rippled through the gathered pack, and Rhea, standing near the front of the crowd with unmistakable pride evident in her expression, stepped forward to complete the ceremonial words that would formally bind Elena's place within Nightfall's community. "Does the pack accept this claim?" Rhea asked, her voice carrying the weight of tradition and formal authority. The response came in a unified chorus of assent, dozens of voices rising together in acceptance that left Elena's eyes brimming with unexpected tears. The sheer scale of the welcome extended to her more overwhelming than she had anticipated. "Then let it be known," Rhea declared, "that Elena Voss stands among us, not as a stranger who once nursed a wounded wolf without knowing his true nature, but as the woman whose compassion and courage helped save not only her mate's life, but the future of this entire pack. May her place among us be honored for as long as Nightfall endures." As the formal ceremony concluded, and gave way to a celebration that stretched long into the evening, Elena found herself repeatedly approached by pack members, eager to express their gratitude and welcome, each conversation adding another thread to the growing sense that this strange, impossible new life had become, somehow, entirely and completely her own. Later that night, as the celebration finally began winding down, and the forest settled into its familiar quiet rhythm, Elena and Kian walked together back toward the small dwelling that had, over the past weeks, gradually transformed from temporary shelter into something resembling a true home. "Any regrets?" Kian asked, glancing at her with a mixture of genuine curiosity and lingering vulnerability, as though some small part of him still could not quite believe she had chosen this life, chosen him, so completely. Elena considered the question seriously, thinking back over the extraordinary weeks since that stormy night, weeks that had transformed her quiet, careful existence into something she could never have imagined and would not trade for anything now. "None," she said finally, with complete certainty. "I found a dying wolf in a storm and decided to save him, without any idea what that decision would lead to. If you'd told me that night everything that would follow, the danger, the discoveries, all of it, I think I still would have made the exact same choice. Even knowing how much danger it would bring into your life?" Kian asked softly. "Especially knowing that," Elena said, reaching for his hand and lacing her fingers through his, with the easy familiarity of two people who had built something real and lasting through fire and uncertainty alike. "Because the danger came with you, Kian, and you turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. I wouldn't trade that for all the safety and quiet in the world." Kian brought her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss against her knuckles, his gold eyes warm with a love that no longer needed careful restraint or guarded distance to protect itself. "Then I suppose it is fortunate for both of us that you never learned to walk past suffering without stopping to help." "Extremely fortunate," Elena agreed, smiling as they continued their walk beneath the ancient trees of the only home either of them wanted any longer. The storm that had first brought them together, now nothing more than a distant memory against the steady, unshakable foundation of everything they had built together since. Behind them, Nightfall territory settled into peaceful rest, its long night of danger and uncertainty finally, truly over, replaced by the quiet promise of a future neither Kian nor Elena had ever dared imagine possible, before a single act of unconditional kindness changed both of their lives forever. And somewhere at the edge of the forest, where a small cottage still stood exactly as Elena had left it, the fireplace where a wounded wolf had once rested his head against a stranger's knee, remained a quiet, permanent reminder of exactly where their extraordinary story had begun. Two lives changed forever, by the simple, courageous choice to save something broken, without ever knowing what it might become.